Line these two planes up on a runway. At first glance, they look like distant cousins. Both have two roaring engines, that proud twin tail, and the grim look of machines born to haul explosives. But look past the guns and the speed. The real story isn't in the riveted aluminum. It's in the cradle that birthed them. The contrast is actually haunting. Across the ocean, the B-25 Mitchell was born a golden boy with a silver spoon. It was the pampered child of North American aviation, the biggest name in United States flight. It was dreamed up in bright, cool offices in Inglewood, California. The engineers there were well paid. They drank hot coffee and drove their cars home every evening. When the B-25 rolled out of the shop, it was treated like a superstar. It was named after the legendary General Billy Mitchell. American pilots said it was a joy to fly, like a sports car rather than a heavy truck. It was the face of American abundance, an industry so rich that if a few screws fell on the floor, nobody even bothered to pick them up. Then you have the Tupolev Tu-2. Its fate was so miserable you'd think it was a spy movie script. You wouldn't expect the best, most modern Soviet bomber to come from a prestigious institute. It didn't. It was born in prison. Literally. In a cell. Its father, Andrei Tupolev, the giant of Russian aviation, was branded an enemy of the people back in 1937. Or during the Great Purge, he was thrown into a Sharashka, Central Design Bureau 29. That was a special prison camp run by the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs Secret Police just for engineers. Imagine the country's greatest geniuses sitting behind bars under armed guard, sketching airplanes just to trade for food and their own lives. People usually think you need freedom and luxury to build something top tier. The Tupolev Tu-2 proved the opposite. The grip of a prison and pure desperation forged a masterpiece. The American B-25 was designed to be easy to fly, easy to fix, easy to build, so anyone could assemble it. But the Tupolev Tu-2, built by those convicts, was designed with one single obsession: absolute performance. For Tupolev and his team, this plane wasn't just a weapon. It was their ticket to freedom. If it failed, they would never see the sun again. The result was an unbelievable paradox. The plane made by prisoners, the Tupolev Tu-2, was faster and sleeker. It hit 547 kilometers per hour compared to the 440 kilometers per hour of the bomber 25. It could haul heavy bombs that the bigger B-25 couldn't even lift on a normal mission. Comparing the Tupolev Tu-2 and the B-25 isn't just about comparing machines. It's a showdown between the power of a free industrial line and the terrifying survival instinct of men in a cage. One side worked out of duty, the other worked for their lives. Sometimes, the man backed into a corner hits the hardest. Will the refined edge of the prisoner beat the heavy firepower of the golden boy in the middle of a war? The answer is going to surprise you. If the battlefield were a racetrack, Tupolev and North American brought two machines with polar opposite mindsets. One side wanted a Formula One race car with a massive trunk. The other wanted a bulletproof Ford F-150 with a machine gun bolted to the roof. Look at the Tupolev Tu-2, though its body is slim, smooth, and sexy in the purest aerodynamic sense. Tupolev didn't design this thing for a casual stroll across the sky. He designed it to outrun death itself. Inside that prison, Tupolev knew speed was the only thing keeping pilots and himself alive. He built the Tupolev Tu-2 like a fighter jet. Run fast so nobody can catch you. The prototype hit a terrifying 635 kilometers per hour with Alexander McEwen 37 engines. Even the mass-produced versions with air-cooled engines reached 547 kilometers per hour. On the Eastern Front, that speed was your best shield. It constantly left, but German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters eating dust. The original specifications for the Tupolev Tu-2 sounded like a sick joke. A bomber that had to dive at a 70-degree angle at a bone-shattering 900 kilometers per hour. Tupolev fought tooth and nail to prove 2 engines were enough for the job. Later, they stripped the dive brakes to speed up production. But that high-stress DNA stayed in the airframe. It made the plane incredibly tough when screaming at high speeds near the ground. This is the Tupolev Tu-2's biggest trick. It looks sleek, but it's a heavyweight lifter. On short-range overload missions, it could haul 3,000 kilograms, sometimes even 4,000 kilograms of bombs. To put that in perspective, that's nearly the same load as a giant Boeing B-17 flying fortress. And it's 3 times the standard load of a B-25. If the Tupolev Tu-2 was like a bodybuilder in a slim-fit suit. Elegant on the outside, pure muscle underneath. On the flip side, the B-25 Mitchell didn't care about being pretty or being the fastest. It was built on the ruthless American philosophy of pragmatism. Good gear is gear that works, is easy to fix, and can be churned out like sausages. Ever notice how the B-25's wings aren't straight? They're cranked like a seagull's wing. That wasn't for style. Originally, the B-25 wobbled in the air like a drunk, what engineers call Dutch roll. The United States engineers bent on outer wings flat to kill that wobble. The result was a rock-solid platform for dropping bombs and firing guns, even if the pilot had to use serious muscle to wrestle it through the sky. If the Tupolev Tu-2 was the scream of a race engine, the B-25 was a jackhammer. It was deafeningly loud. The Wright R2600 engine sat right next to the cockpit. When the pilot keyed the .50 caliber machine guns, the whole plane vibrated like it was falling apart. Rung ban batten hu mon rung rung. It felt like your teeth would shake out of your head. Many B-25 pilots ended up deaf because of that noise and vibration. But that thuggishness, what gave them a sense of security. Like sitting inside a flying tank. This was the peak of American industrial genius. North Americans split the plane into 48 major sub-assemblies. What does that mean in the real world? If the nose gets blown off, you unbolt it and slap a new one on. Need to switch from bombing to hunting ships. Take off the office glass nose, bolt on a thug steel nose with 8 machine guns. This modular design helped the United States build nearly 10,000 planes. That's 4 times the production of the Tupolev Tu-2. Tupolev Tu-2 pilots were like knights on thoroughbred horses. They lived for speed, agility, and flying solo without needing a bodyguard. B-25 pilots were long-haul truckers. Their cabins were loud and the steering was heavy. But they had heaters, hot coffee, and a machine that rarely broke down. If it broke, you just swapped a part and kept rolling. In the design room, it was a battle of aerodynamics. But in the armory, it was a mad race to see who could cram the most death into a single airframe. At the start, the B-25 was a civilized bomber. It had a clear glass nose where a navigator sat comfortably, aiming at targets from 10,000 feet. But the Pacific Theater didn't do civilized. The Japanese were moving supplies on small barges and nimble sailing vessels. Trying to hit those tiny, moving targets from high altitude was like throwing rocks at a needle in a haystack. So, the Americans did something very street. And they modified their planes right there in the field. A legend named Paul "Pappy" Gunn took a saw to that glass nose. He capped it with steel and stuffed it with heavy machine guns. That's how the monsters like the B-25J and B-25H were born. Imagine a plane screaming toward you with 14 to 18.50 caliber machine guns all pointing forward. That's the bomber 25J. One button press, and a hurricane of 12.7 millimeter lead shreds everything. Japanese sailors said their ships looked like Swiss cheese after a B-25 pass, poked with thousands of holes. But they didn't stop there. They did the unthinkable. They took the 75, 8mm M4 cannon straight off a Sherman tank and bolted it into the nose of the B-25G and B-25H. Listen to the pilots talk about the data of shock. Every time that cannon fired, the 15-ton plane kicked back like it hit a brick wall. Airspeed dropped 20 to 30 kilometers per hour instantly from the recoil. Gunsmoke filled the cockpit until the pilots were flying blind. And pity the navigator. He became a manual loader. He had to manhandle 7-kilogram shells, shoving them into the breach while the plane bounced violently through anti-aircraft fire. It was slow, it was brutal, but if he landed a hit, game over. One shell could rip a Japanese patrol boat in half. While the B-25 was a lead storm, the Soviet Tupolev Tu-2 was a surgical assassin. Fewer bullets, but every hit broke a bone. The Tupolev Tu-2 didn't need 18 guns. It used two 20mm Schwack cannons at the wing roots. Here's the technical why. 20mm shells explode on impact. .50 caliber bullets don't. In a head-on dogfight, one burst from a Tupolev Tu-2 would tear the wing off a Messerschmitt, something a machine gun just couldn't do. But where the Tupolev Tu-2 really stepped over the Tu-25 was against hard targets. The European theater was a land of railway bridges and reinforced concrete bunkers. The B-25 usually carried 500-pound bombs. Maybe a 1,000-pounder if they pushed it. Dropping those on a massive concrete bridge was like scratching an itch, just tickling a giant. The Tupolev Tu-2, however, was built for monsters. The FAB-1000, that is a 1-ton bomb. In the 1944 Vyborg offensive, the Tupolev Tu-2 dropped these hammers to collapse bridges and forts that artillery couldn't even touch. This overload capacity of 3 to 4 tons turned a tactical bomber into a heavy hitter, a feat the B-25 simply couldn't copy. If you need to wipe out an airfield or turn a supply train into scrap metal, you call the B-25 and its lead storm. But if you need to drop a vital bridge or punch through an underground bunker, you want the Tupolev Tu-2. You want that diving speed and that 1,000-kilogram bomb under the belly. One is a firestorm, the other is a sledgehammer. Both are terrifying. Both are legends. If design is the blueprint, then the battlefield is the furnace. Out here, there's no room for looks. You're either effective, or you're a wreck on the ground. Both the B-25 and the Tupolev Tu-2 proved their worth in ways that were nothing short of legendary. In the Pacific, the enemy wasn't just the Japanese, it was the vast, empty ocean. Trying to drop a bomb from 3,000 meters onto a ship zigzagging below was a sucker's game. The United States needed a more brutal solution. The B-25 became the answer. Think about standing at a lake and skipping a stone across the water. Now, scale that up. A 15-ton bomber screaming at 400 kilometers per hour, flying so low the propellers are literally slicing through sea spray. Sometimes they were just 15 meters off the waves. That's how B-25 pilots hunted. Instead of dropping bombs down, they skipped 500-pounders across the waves so they'd slam right into the side of the hull. The results: total carnage. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, where B-25 units like the Air Apaches turned a Japanese convoy into a graveyard. Ships that didn't sink immediately were shredded by dozens of .50 caliber machine guns firing at point-blank range. It was so effective that the Japanese practically stopped trying to move supplies by day. We can't talk about the B-25 without April 18, 1942, where Colonel Jimmy Doolittle did something insane. He launched 16 bombers off the deck of the United States ship Hornet. That deck was only 150 meters long, way too short for a medium bomber. But they pulled it off. They flew low to dodge radar, hit Tokyo, and kept going to China. Physically, the damage wasn't huge. But psychologically, it was a knockout blow. It forced Japan to pull its frontline forces back to defend the home islands. It changed the entire strategy of the Pacific War. If the B-25 was a gunslinging cowboy, the Tupolev Tu-2 was a heavyweight boxer. It was quiet. It could take a punch, and when it hit, things stayed broken. By 1944, though the Red Army was punching back, they needed a hammer to crack German concrete. Joseph Stalin himself ordered the 334th Bomber Division protected like the apple of his eye. Why? Because the Tupolev Tu-2 was a game changer. Its speed, reaching 547 kilometers per hour, was its best shield. It was so fast the Soviets let them fly day missions without fighter escorts. They'd dive in, dump those massive one-ton bombs that other planes like the Petlyakov P-2 couldn't even lift, and vanish before the Luftwaffe could scramble. In the Vyborg offensive, the 12th Regiment flew 700 sorties, erasing rail stations and bridges, paralyzing the German reinforcements. But this is what Soviet pilots loved most. The Tupolev Tu-2 wouldn't die. The data is staggering. In the heat of 1944, it took the Germans an average of 465 sorties just to bring down a single Tupolev Tu-2. The pilots would limp home on one engine, their fuselages looking like Swiss cheese from anti-aircraft fire, and still make a landing. That stability on a single engine was a guardian angel that very few bombers of that era could match. Looking back at the big picture, the B-25 severed the main artery of Japan on the sea, leaving their island troops to starve. The Tupolev Tu-2 was the sledgehammer, breaking the strongest concrete locks on the road to Berlin. They didn't just fly missions. They redefined what a bomber could be. Not just a drop-and-run machine, but a direct attack weapon of total destruction. If you asked a pilot who'd flown both of these machines, though men like that were rare, they'd tell you they belong in two different universes. One was a brutal fight for physical survival. The other was the pure joy of engineering. Don't let those Hollywood movies fool you. B-25 pilots weren't sitting back like they were in a Cadillac. Flying this bird was back-breaking manual labor. You see, the B-25 had zero hydraulic boost for its flight controls. None. Everything, every turn, every climb depended entirely on the pilot's muscles, connected to the wings by nothing but raw steel cables. Test reports from back were then described it vividly. When the plane tilted, the nose felt like it weighed 1,000 tons. Pilots sometimes couldn't even pull the stick with one hand. During landings, it wasn't uncommon to hear the co-pilot screaming, "Pull! pull, as both men yanked back on the controls together just to keep the nose from slamming into the dirt. But the real nightmare, that started if an engine cut out. The plane would try to spin sideways instantly. To keep it straight, the pilot had to stomp on the rudder pedal with everything he had. The feedback was so violent they'd have to stand up on the pedal, bracing their shoulders against the seat just to find enough leverage. After a training flight, pilots would climb down with their legs trembling uncontrollably. One leg would be dead numb, the other stiff as a rock from the strain. That's what they called idle foot. And then there was the noise. Your seat sat just 20 inches away from a 1,700 horsepower Wright Cyclone engine. There was no modern soundproofing. It was like a lion roaring in your ear for 10 hours straight. Many B-25 vets ended up with permanent hearing loss, a brutal price for a solid machine. But for all that sweat, the B-25 gave you absolute peace of mind. It felt like a flying tank. It forgave rookie mistakes and could survive slam-down landings that would snap the gear off any other aircraft. The Tu-2 was the total opposite of American muscle. It brought a level of refinement that was shocking, especially since it was born in a prison cell. Soviet pilots, used to wrestling the notoriously difficult PE-2, fell in love with the Tu-2 instantly. The reports were glowing. Simple to fly, easy to take off, even easier to land. Despite its heavy bomb load, the superior aerodynamics meant it responded to the slightest touch. Pilots could pull tight, high-G turns to dodge flak without needing a weightlifting belt. This was the Tu-2's killer feature: its single-engine performance. While B-25 pilots were fighting for their lives just to stay level on one engine, the Tu-2 was rated relatively easy to fly in that state. It held its line, giving the pilot the calm he needed to navigate, and home through a swarm of German flak instead of panicking. And for a Russian pilot flying in -30-degree winters, the Tu-2 was heaven. The cockpit was sealed tight, warm, and laid out perfectly. One test pilot famously blurted out, "It's a beautiful machine." The equipment is actually pleasant. Compared to the freezing, primitive Soviet planes that came before it, the Tu-2 was a massive leap in user experience. When you climb into a B-25, you're a heavy machinery operator. It's loud, it's shaky, and it's exhausting, but it's powerful and a damn near indestructible. When you climb into a Tu-2, you're an artist. It's smooth, it's fast, and it obeys your every command. It's a fascinating paradox. American industrial pragmatism gave us a bulletproof truck, while Soviet prisoners gave us a refined race car. When the smoke of World War II finally cleared, both the B-25 and the Tu-2 had fulfilled their missions. But the lessons they left behind were worlds apart. One was a victory of industrial mass production. The other was a triumph of human intellect rising above iron bars. The B-25 wasn't the fastest plane in the sky, and it didn't carry the biggest bombs. But it was the undisputed champion of versatility. Nearly 10,000 units were built, a massive testament to the American philosophy. Don't try to make one perfect thing for one job. Make one good thing that can do every job. The B-25 taught the military world a billion-dollar lesson in open architecture. From one single airframe, the Americans built a bomber, a transport, a trainer, a reconnaissance scout, and most terrifyingly, the gunship. Those B-25 H and J models, with their solid steel noses packed with machine guns, were the birth of modern close air support. The idea of turning a heavy, clunky plane into a flying ammo crate was the direct DNA for future legends, like the AC-47 Spooky in Vietnam and the Angel of Death, the AC-130 Spectre. Today, if they hadn't performed those crazy experiments like bolting a tank cannon to a B-25, the history of air support would look very different. The Tu-2 didn't have the massive production numbers of the B-25, but it was the champion of engineering quality. It stands as a monument proving that even when you strip a man of his freedom, his mind, and his love for his country can still create a masterpiece. Think about the context. Andrei Tupolev and his team sketched this plane while they were prisoners in a sharashka. They weren't working for bonuses or fame. They were working to prove they weren't criminals and to save their nation from the Nazi invasion. The Tu-2 was better than the P-2, a plane designed in much better conditions, in both payload and handling. That fact was a technical slap to the face of the men who imprisoned Tupolev. It forced them to set him free and restore his honor. Everything learned on the Tu-2, especially handling high-speed aerodynamics and high-stress airframes, became the capital for the Soviet future. It led to the Tu-4, and eventually, the great strategic bombers. Those bare Tu-95s still roaring through the skies today, and the White Swan Tu-160. They all carry the DNA of the rugged, practical design philosophy Tupolev forged in that prison cell. If you put these two on the scales of history, the B-25 Mitchell is the typical American soldier. Geared up to the teeth, practical, loud, a bit rough around the edges, but incredibly reliable and present everywhere. It represents the power of logistics and industry. The Tupolev Tu-2 is the Soviet Grandmaster. Sharp, recalculating, capable of enduring extreme hardship and delivering a lethal, precise strike. It represents the power of intellect and will. Both were great. Not because they were killing machines, but because they were the peak of human creativity in our darkest hour. Looking back, we realize the best weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. It's a mind that refuses to break, and a heart that adapts to any nightmare.